Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are around the world. My name is Eric Wilson. I'm going to be joining you for the next 6 hours. I'm happy you can join us today. Kicking off this next IBF online seminar is a great opportunity to sit in the comfort of your home or your office and be able to get some good knowledge. Unfortunately, I am not Mark. If you're looking forward to hearing him today, I actually was disappointed myself. I was looking forward to him, but there was some unforeseen circumstances, some family things that happened, and keep him in your prayers. Unfortunately, he could not make it, so I'm filling in at the last minute. Because of this, is kind of going to be a mixed match of slides. Part of the slides were his, part of the slides I helped put together yesterday and we're presenting to you today. So you could actually benefit from kind of the best of two thought leaders in one to bring you the fundamentals of demand and forecasting and planning. So you're going to get the best of his slides and some of my slides I added as well to be able to come together as one. So his slides I may muddle through a little bit. It shouldn't be that much problems. I've seen his presentation before, so I'm familiar with some of the things he talks about. And I think we're on the same page because we're all work towards our CPF and certification, and I hope many of you are working on the same things out there as well. So with that, we're going to jump in today. A little bit about myself. I am a thought leader with the Institute of Business Forecasting. Currently work at a company called Escalade Sports as Director of Business Planning for them. So I have a day job as well. I'm actually was awarded the IBF award in 2016 for thought leadership, demand planning, excellence, and as well. The most important thing on this slide, though, would actually be the LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I post a lot of articles through IBF. Very active there. I post other things that they do and other things relative to our field. So if you want to keep abreast of what's going on, I highly recommend that you find me on LinkedIn, send me a LinkedIn invitation. I'll be able to, accept and send you one back, and we can become LinkedIn friends and be able to follow, because I'm interested in following you as well. I said I do work at Escalade Sports. If you haven't heard of them, they own about 47 different brands that you may be familiar with, everything from Gorilla and Goliath basketball, Bear Archery, Stiga table tennis, pickleball. If you haven't heard of pickleball, we're one of the leaders in the pickleball market. It's growing. We own a few paddles and balls in that market as well. So I'm a Director of Planning there. IBF, hopefully you're familiar with IBF. You're here today, but IBF is really about learn, share, and advance. You're here to learn. I'm here sharing, and really together we advance. But this is an iterative process. I hope you pick up from information today. I see you at future conferences. We have conferences around the globe. We have one coming up in Orlando in October, one in Amsterdam in November. And throughout the year, we in other cities as well. So hopefully see you at a future conference. Hopefully you decide to go on and get certified as well. And then keep abreast of what's going in trends over the Journal of Business Forecast and our blog at demand-planning.com as well. As far as today, it's really broken up into 4 sections. We're going to start off with a broad overview and the process of demand planning, business forecasting, demand management. That's going to take us about an hour and 15 minutes into this. We're going to take a short break. We're going to have a couple morning break and an afternoon break for me. It's about a 15-minute break. So about an hour and 15 minutes. We'll get, after our break, then we're going to get into our second topic, which is data management and matrix. Some KPIs that we need to understand, and a little bit about the data as well. That's going to take us about another hour. So in about 2 hours and 30 minutes, we're going to be breaking for section 2. In the afternoon for me, then it's going to go into effective communication and have an afternoon break, and then forecasting methods and models at the end for the last section. As far as questions, there is a capability on the side. You can see the little area for, you can actually insert questions. I'd recommend, hey, if you got questions, ask. The only thing though, logistically this morning, because of the content, so much content, I'm really going to be holding off answering any questions to the end of section 2, or the end of our morning session today, is when I'll really, be able to jump back in here, respond to questions, and be able to, answer some of the questions you have. So you can hold them up and just ask them all at the end, or you can ask them as you go, either one. We usually get a lot of questions. I'm not sure I can get them all answered. This is just a high-level overview. I'll do the best I can to touch some of the points that may not be clear, but we'll hold some time at the end of the morning and the end of the afternoon, generally for Q&A purposes. I said I'll be talking to you from a phone and from a computer in an office in the middle of Kentucky right now, the home of bourbon and Kentucky Fried Chicken. You're welcome. So it's kind of impersonal to me, so I'll do my best to really spice it up and give you some life to these slides. But as I said, if there is anything that's unclear, please let us know, and then at the end, we might be able to come back, follow up, make it a little more clear at the time. You have the capability on your side to listen on your own as well. If you do need to go to the bathroom, just raise your hand or something. I'll be allowed let you go to the bathroom. Please put your phone on silent so I won't hear them. Really, there's really the aspect of you interacting with us as well as only through this chat box at the side. So please, at the end, make sure we let you know you're here and what's going on, any problems you have. Section 1, overview and process. So with that, we're going to jump right into this. I usually like to lead off with a quote, kind of get you thinking, get you interested. So the first quote I have is, if you have to forecast, forecast often. So what exactly is your mission, or our mission, Larry, when it comes to business forecasting? In the IBF, business forecasting is a process of using the analytics, the data, the insights, and the experience to make predictions and respond to various business needs. Our goal is to go beyond knowing what has happened and provide the best assessment of what will happen in the future and drive better decision-making across the organization. This leads to customer service level achievement, timely availability of products or services, achievement of overarching company goals, efficiency and effectiveness within the supply chain, strategic influencing of demand, demand shaping, being able to orchestrate demand, and revenue and profitability. You really impact your service, your cost, and your cash are all impacted by your demand planning and business forecasting. So what exactly are we talking about then? Once again, going back to the definitions we have, demand plan is a projection of the future that combines a knowledge of the past with the best assessments of future need of a product or service. Demand planning then simply is those processes and techniques used to create the demand plan. Taking this one step further, if you take a demand planner, that's obviously the one that is responsible and facilitates the demand planning process. The role is key, ensuring the compliance and best practices. They help establish and then monitor the controls in the process, looking at the KPIs, and making sure this is an iterative process that continues over time. Demand management is really something different then. Demand management is taking that demand plan and then identifying what needs to happen to make that accomplish, what different constraints you may have as well. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So when you're looking at forecasting, if you took a forecast plus operations or supply chain, basically that's an S&OP process. If I were to take forecast plus a finance, that's basically my FP&A process. Forecast plus marketing is my product life cycle management. Forecast with the executives and strategic goals is your business efficiency planning. Forecast plus an external customer, that's CPFR, collaborative planning and forecast replenishment. Basically, everything starts with a forecast. A forecast is a driving force between most business planning processes. And if you go back, a demand plan is that future projection of what's going to happen. What's driving all that. So considerations then when you're forecasting is, what exactly are you forecasting? Who is your customer? This isn't just the external customer as well, it's the internal customer. Who's using that forecast inside your organization? And why do they need that forecast? What's that forecast needed for? Is it a finance FP&A process? Is it part of the supply chain and looking at an S&OP process? Understand who that internal customer is. And it really, most likely, is going to be multiple internal customers that's using your forecast. So what's the purpose of the forecast then? What are they going to do with that forecast? Why do they need a forecast? Why are they looking for a projection for? Understanding that as well. Which systems will you be using to make the forecast? Or what systems are they going to be using? What level of granularity do they need? How important are the past and estimates of the future? Is there other drivers that are really making an impact on that forecast that you need to understand and predict as well? And then, are you looking at dollars or units, orders or shipments? Are you forecasting on weekly versus monthly buckets? The first step you need to take in forecasting is to ask yourself, why? Understand the business problem that needs to be solved with this forecast, which includes your customer, the purpose, the system, units, and what you're forecasting. All that plays into a part of it. Another aspect is time horizon. Different forecasts are looking at different things. So really, when you're looking at executional, or really that use of the plan, is generally within a month. Now, it could be different for different companies. Some looking at within the week or next 2 weeks, and really you're forecasting 3-4 weeks out in weekly buckets. Other companies looking at monthly buckets, saying within this month, I'm not really going to be able to impact the forecast. So where decisions are made and where you can design a plan is generally where you're impacting the most and is where you're forecasting. So you understand where your forecast fits in the horizon of the company based on who that customer is and the needs as well. Some general principles of forecasting. Some of these are intuitive, you may have heard before, but the first one obviously is forecasts are rarely 100% accurate. They're not expected to be perfect. Forecasts are based on statistical probabilities usually, and errors are inevitable. Because of that, number two, every forecast should include an estimate of error. You should, if you know you're not going to be 100% perfect, you should be able to present that the best you can as far as a range of what the forecast can be going forward or for a point. Understand, number three, that forecasts are more accurate for families or product groups. So the higher the level of aggregation, the better the forecast most likely can be. A good analogy is when you're looking at, individual cola versus all the different styles of cola or the different configurations of cola. Obviously, when you get down to a location configuration of a specific cola, it's going to be hard to forecast than if you just did an aggregated cola. And the last, looking at your aggregation of time or long and short-term forecast. The further out you are, the more capability for unexpected events to happen. So, and also the more likely you're going to have more forecast error or inaccuracy, the further out you try to forecast. The last thing on demand management is looking at the customer is always driving the demand usually. So demand management helps influence and shape demand through marketing and sales activities and recognize demand through forecasting and customers' orders. So with this, you're actually adding in those shaping capabilities in demand management to be able to influencing demand. You're also looking at constraints and being able to shift demand in demand management as well. So demand management takes that demand plan and turns it into managing that plan by influencing and shaping or shifting sometimes demand through marketing and sales activities as well. Looking at the forecast side, there's lots of inputs that come into that. So we talked about some of the needs. We talked about why you're forecasting and a lot of the purposes of forecasting. The other aspect is what's coming into the forecast. What are the inputs of forecast? And there's a lot of different inputs that you have to kind of balance. I heard someone say once that demand planning is more about managing assumptions than it is about managing numbers. And I really think that's true. We're assumption managers more so than we are number jockeys. Our job is to really look at all these inputs, look at understanding those needs, and really taking those assumptions and developing a plan from all that is really what our purpose and job is. To do that, we have to know a lot of things besides just the forecast model. Forecast model is going to be the last thing we touch on today. Before then, we have to understand really the entire business. We have to know our product, the drivers that are really driving the consumer demand. What are those? They could be macro, they could be, individual store level types of things going on, but what's driving that consumer demand? The closer we can get the consumer and understand that demand and consumer sentiment, the better we are to be able to predict what they're going to be able to purchase, what they'll be purchasing. Historic patterns of demand. Understand those historic patterns that are happening at the product level. Lift factors, promotional advertising, how that is impacting. Price elasticity type models, customer and customer needs, emerging product needs, competitors, what are they doing? What are new sources of competition? And it's generally the macro part of your industry as well. Is what's the industrial trends? Are people moving away from certain types of products and moving into other types of products overall? Understanding all those product considerations is one aspect, but you also have to understand your competitors. You have to understand what brands they have, their pricing, their advertising, their marketing. What's their 3 Ps that they're doing as well? Besides that, you have to understand that market really in depth as well. Who the target customer is, the demographics, the geographic, competitive presence in that area, the economic conditions and trends in that area, the industrial factors, different types of product purchase patterns, both from the customer or the consumer itself. The customer you may sell to, or if you don't sell to the end user, or that end user that your customer is selling to understand those patterns as well. You do need to understand your customer. How does the customer decide when and where to buy? Some of the seasonal sides of the price sensitivity they have, how sensitive they are to different promotions, the economic profile of your customer. How do they react when different things happen? The availability of substitutions and brands. Are they willing, if you don't have something in stock, are they going to have more pin-up demand? Or are they going to go buy your competitor and you're going to lose market share? Understanding those aspects. Understanding the events of holidays. I was in a mattress industry, and for some reason, presidents sell mattresses because the consumer was conditioned to buy every President's Day because that's when the sales occurred. So as you condition the consumer, that President's Day meant mattress sales. So we had to be able to understand that impact. One of the things that came back from that is we didn't need to do the marketing anymore. We were compounding that with sales. We were compacting that with promotions. So when you looked at understanding the customer, how much of it was price sensitivity, how much of it was promotional response, how much of it was just consumer conditioned to a holiday. So we had to peel those pieces, but really understanding that customer help us not only drive the marketing plan, but also drive the forecast as well. When you're looking at forecasting, there's a couple different types of demand that you're going to encounter: independent and dependent demand. And I apologize if I'm moving through this kind of quick. I said there's a lot of material this morning, and I'm just kind of giving you the high overview. So I'm going to hit these key points kind of as we go through. So I apologize if I'm feeding you through a hose right now with information. So we'll slow down here in a little bit when we get to some other parts. But first of all, looking at the different types of demand, independent versus dependent demand. Independent demand is a product that is not related to the demand of any other product. So they have the example here as an automobile manufacturer forecast demand for motor vehicles. It's the demand for the vehicle itself, which is independent. Dependent demand are then related to another product. Example would be the tires, the steering wheel, the components, or the other aspects that are then part of the vehicle. Demand for components is dependent on the number of vehicles then we'd sell. Now, there is things that are both independent and dependent. Examples would be tires. I can go out and buy tires independently. So I have an independent demand I could forecast for tires. As far as the dependent demand, though, that's based on how many vehicles I sell. It's key because when you're forecasting, you should only forecast independent demand. Dependent demand should never be forecast, it's calculated. Now, ultimately, the need of tires that's going to be built, going to be sourced, going to be warehoused, is going to be my independent demand plus my calculated dependent demand but my demand plan is based on what I'm going to sell, which is the independent demand, and any dependent demand I sell independently. So it's a little bit of a nuance, but it's important, especially when you start getting into regression analysis, or when you're really trying to forecast what's going to happen in the upcoming months, understanding those differences. So here's my first question. Mark had quite a few of these true-false questions in his presentation. I left most of them in. They were great questions. They track very closely to some of the questions you may see on the certification. So if anybody's planning on going on for certification, these are some sample questions you're going to get. So I'll give the questions out, give you a little bit of time to think about each one before we go on. So there's a few of these questions to kind of break it up every now and then. Most of them are true, false through the entire presentation. So the first question then would be, demand forecasting should take into account the limitations to product availability and product constraints. So what do you think it is? Do you think it's true or false? Now, I alluded to this a little bit on the last couple slides, especially the last slide. I talked about it. I even used the word constraints a couple times in discussing it and about what we're focusing on. So when you came to the answer, if your answer was false, you are correct. Our goal was to come up with an unconstrained forecast. Now, at the same time, I have seen this actually, and even in my world right now, become true. The reason being is because I'm producing an unconstrained forecast, but sometimes constraints cause customers not to order. If I'm in a retail business and I don't have product available, there's no reason forecasting sales because sales are not going to happen. Now, the ideal is to get as closer to consumer sentiment and understand what the consumer demand would have been. But even in our world, I understand the false, but we end up having product availability ends up being a constraint on occasion. But if you get the question on a test, the answer would be false. Because it's really looking at there's two kind of competing roles inside organizations. There's really a separation of power or responsibility. The demand manager and supply manager. And I cringe when I see a company where you have a combination of one person trying to do both roles. Because really, demand manager really needs to sit outside of a supply chain, sit out as an independent type of role. And really, they're responsible for compiling a demand forecast, which is an unconstrained demand plan. And it represents the amount of product we will sell in a given month for a specific location, is really what they're trying to do. The supply plan really takes that and creates that constrained plan. But you really, what we're focusing on today is that left side of this picture of the demand manager, which is really that unconstrained plan. The reason you want unconstrained plan is because you're trying to create the best picture of what could happen. Because back to the demand management piece of it, what could happen is if we can't make it because of certain constraints, maybe we can shift demand. Maybe we can find ways to shape demand if things aren't coming through. Maybe we can expedite and find ways to alleviate some of these constraints. The only way to understand those constraints is to go back to understanding exactly what those constraints are by producing an unconstrained demand plan. So our responsibility is to provide the best signal possible of what's going to happen regardless of what constraints may occur. So I talked a little bit about the product side of it, and the way we're pushing, supply planning or a product to, really be what they can do. We alluded to the marketing side of it as well, and sales side of demand shifting and demand shaping aspect as well. But virtually any decision or process in a company is based on a time lag between the judgment and the result of the decision requires a forward-looking assumption, i.e. a prediction, i.e. a forecast. So every business decision is based on a forward-looking assumption or a forecast, which kind of goes back to the one slide, is really we are the, start any business process really starts with a prediction or a forecast. Looking back from a supply chain aspect, the forecast is the foundational element of the demand plan of other downstream plans. So the demand management is only as good as the unconstrained forecast of which it's based. So with that comes one of the things we always hear talking about targets. And this is where we talked about demand management, it's the unconstrained plan sometimes. I've also heard from the sales side of it where forecasts are really pushed to become targets. And understand there is a difference between the targets. Kind of mentioned this with forecasts, it's the unbiased, unconstrained prediction or estimate of the actual value at a future time. The target's really that desired outcome at the future time. So we don't want to make the forecast make the target the forecast. So really when you're looking at this, the forecast becomes your error. The plan then becomes that variance to the forecast. The target becomes the gap that you have. And the same way you went through from the supply side saying, this is my unconstrained plan, here's my constrained, where's that gap? And how do we mitigate that gap or understand some opportunities or risks in that gap? We really need to take a similar approach with the target as well. If you have sales or executive targets, so what needs to happen in the future, that shouldn't be your forecast, that should be your gap. Then we looked at how can we mitigate those risks, opportunities in that gap of being able to fulfill that forecast going forward. So the next question for you then, a bottom-up forecast or plan. So bottom up, we're taking all the sales, we're going to have them all forecast, we're going to aggregate that up into a top line aggregated forecast number. This will guarantee the most accurate estimates of the demand. True or false? What do you think? Give you a second or two here to think about this one. Now, I'm hoping this one's obvious to a lot of people. I shouldn't say that in case someone gets it wrong and I tell you the answer. But most of the time, the answer is false. A bottom-up forecast generally adds bias. It magnitudes errors, and you're going to end up with because at lower level the noise is more than the signal is. So you end up compounding that from a bottoms up and ends up being less accurate than if you forecasted at higher levels. It also goes back to some of those principles we talked about at the beginning as well. Next question. So if we're talking about consensus then, consensus forecast means that a process participants agree on every detail and assumptions contained in the forecast or plan being developed. So what do you think? Obviously, this one would be false as well. There's a one number attitude that a gentleman named Pat used to say, and I just love his quote, and I've used it ever since I heard him say that. But there's a one number attitudes where you need to have. Doesn't necessarily mean you agree on every detail. It means you can come to consensus that the company is going forward with, and you can bridge to plans that are being active, whether it be a financial plan, whether it be a operational plan or a logistical plan. They can bridge to the same set of assumptions and same number going forward, so everybody can be clear on that. So it's the one number attitude is really more important than having everybody agree on every single detail. The forecasting process itself, I mentioned it was iterative. And this really is the first time to kind of lay out exactly what this process means. It all starts where, at the very beginning, we talked about defining the need. What's the business purpose? Why are we forecasting? And this really goes for any machine learning project that you have to a monthly forecasting. You know, I got 10 items that I'm using my time series history forecast for. No matter what forecast you're doing, there's a purpose you're doing it. Defining that need and understanding that need is the first aspect, which includes the data requirements, the system you have, the input you're going to have, the outputs needed, how much time you need to spend on it. All those things are really defining that need. The next thing is really obtaining that right information. This can be from internal sources, external sources. It can be quantitative and qualitative. So it can be, you know, historic data you have, internal structured data you have of historic sales, or it could be external website clicks that you have. It could be judgmental input from sales. All those things can be input into your forecasting process. The next, you're going to look at and really analyze and clean the data. Not take data at face value, but understand exactly what, if you have the right data and the right structure. You're looking at different methods, test those methods, and being able really develop a forecast, implement the method, execute that plan, which is delivering the plan, managing the outputs. And then from that is where we're understanding what kind of error we have, what are the sources of those errors, which then feed back into the process to improve upon it, which makes it that iterative process. This can be a weekly cycle. It could be a daily cycle. It could be a monthly cycle, or it could be an ad hoc type of process that's done once every few months or annual, even on some products. But the goal of this is to really understand these process steps and go through these process steps on an iterative basis of defining the need, gathering your information, testing your hypothesis and methods, executing it, implementing it, putting it in production, and then evaluating it and making this a feedback loop. Next, we're looking at what exactly is the role of a demand planner. Demand planner, we're the orchestrator, the orchestra leader, we're the process champion, the process organizer. We're generally responsible for collecting and coordination of all the data, analyzing the data, forecasting and plan analysis, understanding the error and sources of the error. And we really play that liaison between all the functions in the organization, all the functions that will provide inputs or we need to provide an output to. And as we already have seen, everybody really needs the forecast. So with this, we really need to be that liaison between all functions. So we're managing a process and we're managing that relationships between functions as well, is really what our role is. At the same time, we have to have that core understanding of the analytics and the forecasting aspect of it that is really tying everything together. So in a lot of ways, we're that unicorn inside of an organization that really has multiple roles and has to wear multiple hats at different times, from the analytics to the storyteller, to the collaborator, to the process champion, we really play multiple roles inside of an organization, which is the reason why I love demand planning. I'm excited about it, because we do get to touch so many functions, and we are such a vital role inside of an organization in importance. So going back to kind of a sample of a demand planning process, and this is just a sample. This isn't, textbook, go and do it exactly this way. If it works for you, great. But this is one I've used multiple times at different organizations. We're actually using it now. And what it looks at is the different aspects. You can see at the top is really that data gathering. What you're not seeing here is the purpose of the forecast. I'm assuming we understand the why beforehand. So this going into the forecasting. So it's the data gathering at the top, developing the models, the inputs you have, gaining consensus, developing a consensus forecast, and then taking that into a demand plan and execution and management of that plan. And it breaks it out in two different ways, one from a customer focus and a market focus, and keeping all those things and very in tune and understanding. So when you come to the data side of it, it's really about the collecting the data, the filtering and cleaning the data, analyzing that data in collaboration with key functions of inputs needed, the modeling, specifying the model, test the model, select the model. It's also integrating the inputs into the model as well, because some of the inputs may be judgmental. It may be overrides to this model. So it may be a statistical baseline forecast, which is a great place to start, but then it's adding overrides and judgmental inputs. So you end up with more of a combination model to really develop into that consensus model at the end. I think the key, though, we need to focus on is data collection may be 60, 80% of what we do. The modeling may be another 20 to 30% of what we do. The part that really gets overlooked a lot of times then is that last aspect of it. We need to communicate the forecast properly to manage the demand. But we also need to measure and track. Errors are not there as really a stick to beat up on demand planners of you didn't, give us enough forecast accuracy. That's the reason we have too much inventory, or the reason we missed the sales because your forecast was wrong. That's not the purpose of a forecast error. It's really developed to help analyze and make this process better. You need to look at errors and monitor them, identify sources of error, analyze those error sources, understand the data and process assumptions that went into it could have caused issues, adjust data models appropriately so you won't have those things going forward, and incorporate those in the next forecast. Those things are to track more so than to measure the effectiveness of it. It's more to track and then to bring those to incorporate back into the forecast to make it better. And I can hear a few people laughing when I said that the forecast shouldn't be used as a stick to beat you up for too much inventory and not missing the sale. Believe me, I know it happens. I get beat on sometimes as well. But internally, we have to understand the causes of those errors so we can communicate those. And that goes back to one of our goals, is being able to be a storyteller, be able to understand that and be able to communicate those things, and then use that information to go and make it better going forward. So the next question. A statistical forecast is the best starting point for a forecast in order to minimize the bias. So what do you think? Is a statistical forecast the best starting point? I hope everybody answered true. And it really goes back to a couple of things I talked about. One, we talked about the bottoms up, and I mentioned that a bottoms up forecast generally increases your bias. You generally having bias. There's actually been studies about this, looking at every time a human touches, more times than not, it adds bias than takes bias away. So if you have multiple humans touching, you're generally going to add more bias. The other aspect as well is every time a human touches in judgment, you end up with more likely than bias. So having that statistical baseline and starting point is a good reference point for a forecasting process. And it's one that you should really strive to have in your organization as well. If you go back to the view I had of our demand planning process, we gather our inputs from the past, we're cleansing historic data that we have, and we develop a statistical model and forecast. That's my first step. There's other models that we are then using, but I'm really basing it off of that statistical model as that baseline that I'm adding either overrides to or other models are incorporated in with, but this is my first model that I'm looking at as a statistical model. This does not rule out participation though. Participation is essential to a forecasting process. You really need operational and supply chain, you need finance input, you need marketing and sales, key customer and other types of management inputs. Anybody really who has an input that can improve a forecasting process, has a domain expertise, really can be part or should be part of a forecasting process and find ways to incorporate and make sure you're adding value, but find ways to incorporate and really add value in this process. So, forecast and planning information needs of the participating function tends to be fairly similar across the board. So what they're giving you and why they need a forecast is pretty much the same across all functions, or fairly similar across the board with all functions. What do you think? Do you think most functions need and are giving you the same information? False. You're going to see wildly different information from different functions, and their needs of information are widely different as well. If you look at it, breaking it down between some key different functions from a supply chain, production, logistics perspective, demand can be by the item or the SKU. They need a lot more granularity a lot of times. They need to be understand what they're going to buy, what they're going to build, where they're going to need to have that item in inventory. They're looking at inventory numbers as what are we going to have to build for inventory to be able to protect that item. They're going to look at costs, material, labor. Those are the things they're using your forecast for, is to help better understand kind of some of the materials and labor costs that are involved with it. They're trying to plan their production more efficiently. What capacity do they need as well to be able to build? So these are just some of the top ones. The reason they're looking at that granular forecast and some of the uses that they're taking that forecast and converting it into something else. From a marketing perspective, looking at something a little bit different. They're going to really think about market size and category. They may look at individual items if the promotion is on that item, but they may look at more of a category of items as well, to really which category we're going to focus on and how we're going to, raise this brand awareness. So it may be at a higher level of aggregation. They may not be as concerned of where. At the same time, they may be. If they're looking at omni-channel versus online versus in-store, the where may come into it. But as far as an item location, a lot of times they're less concerned. But they do want to understand their consumers and their end users a little bit better. So they're trying to determine some of the buying patterns and the why of that consumer. They want to understand that so they can target market characteristics of that consumer as well. Price. How does price impact? How does promotion impact? Understanding those aspects of it. New product. They help us with new product development of what products we need to, look at replacing. and how the new product may impact a market that they're currently not in. Competitive factor and seasonal factors as well. So these are some of the perspectives from our marketing. From a sales perspective, it's how am I going to be able to make sure I service and satisfy the customer? What's some of the customer trends? So this one is going to be very more customer focused a lot of times. So they're going to look at the items they sell to their customers at their store locations. And it gets really, that level of granularity is really what we're focused on. At the same time, they may not care about the item side, just give me the customer detail. What customers? And then I want to know what's, trending as far as items up or down, but I don't need to look at every single item for the customer. I just need to know the ones I need to focus on. We need geographic differences. Sometimes what's one area doing versus the other area? We have a hurricane hit one area, that's going to impact my sales. Okay, what's happening in other geographic areas as well, so I understand really that impact I may have had of weather, price trends that's going on, competitive factors. Finance and accounting, they're really the ones that's going to monetize the plans. What's this do to my revenue, my cash flow, my capital investment? What's the inventory going to make my working capital changes? What am I going to consider this as far as sales? And I understand what my what am I as far as bad debts and uncollectible accounts that may occur this next year from this top line revenue. Warranty and repairs, what are we bringing back because of sales? If there's a certain, failure rate of items that you have going out into the marketplace, the list, looking at list management and being able to hedge that list, opportunities and ways we can, capitalize on some of those opportunities dollars. So they're looking at monetizing those plans is what they're trying to do. Human resources even has benefits from a forecast. You don't think about that a lot, but a lot of what we talked about really goes back some time to, capacity planning, things of that sort, looking at really head count. But the other things that you're looking at it from, you can look at it from employees by function, skills, number of people you need, personnel turnover, the training needs, the changes in work hours during peak times, during off-peak times, looking at benefits of health, pension, post-retirement. Everything can play in when you're looking at the people side of it as well. And last of all, looking at it from the executive management perspective. From the executive management perspective, we're looking at it as things as far as business expansion, business investment that we have, M&A, mergers and acquisitions, strategic actions that can be taken, competitive positioning, economic conditions, financial market conditions, business capitalization. They're really looking at it from the lens of more strategically, that list management as well falls into this probably. So it's what risk and opportunities we have that fit into our strategic plans and how can we capitalize or mitigate them. So you're really looking at that business expansion of a new market or a new company or a new product line because the information they can gain from a forecast and business plan. So with that, it goes to the overview of the first section. So the overview is there are differences between forecast and target and a demand plan and demand management. So hopefully I stressed the key differences between that. We don't want that forecast to be the target to become that forecast. And there is the difference between the forecast, the plan variance, and then the gap in the target. At the same time, there's a difference between the demand plan and demand management. The demand plan is an unconstrained forecast, and demand management is that gap to the demand plan sometimes, is the difference between the two. Demand management is the influencing of the demand plan, shaping and shifting to be able to make the demand plan. There's also a difference between independent and dependent demand. One of them you forecast, the latter one we calculate. Independent demand are the independent items that you sell. Dependent demand are calculated based on how many of the dependent demand go into one of the independent demands. Forecasting is a process, not a single point result. Said we're assumption managers is pretty much what our role is. I like that title. I wear it with pride. So more so than a single point result, we are managing a process. That process includes data gathering, statistical modeling, assumption management, consensus building, and then executing and measuring the results of that plan as well. That plan is an iterative plan that really needs that feedback loop as well. And the other part about is not a single point, besides just being the process side of it as well, is we know we're not going to be 100% accurate. So we really have to present those forecasts with the uncertainty that's inherent with that, so the end users understand that, whether it be a range forecast that say, hey, here's my point because I know your system needs that and this is what you're looking for and you can dollarize this, but here's my high and my low that can occur with this as well. So be able to understand that the uncertainty that comes with that forecast as well. And collaboration can and should be done both internally and externally with partners to improve and provide solutions more efficiently, and effectively. I'll throw that word in there next time as well. So collaboration is key. We talked about really starting your forecasting process with a statistical forecast. Actually, we're starting it with the why, and then we're bringing in the data. But in the forecasting, we're then going to do a statistical forecast really as our baseline. But collaboration is key. Not only input some time into that statistical model that we have is key, but also after that being able to understand other variables that may not be included in statistical models. So a lot of sales are the closest a lot of times to the customer and understand things that the model may not know. Bringing that information back is key. Marketing may be running promotions that models don't know, and you need to be able to bring that information as key. Executives may understand strategic direction and things going on that the models don't know. Bringing that information back in is key. So collaboration is a key piece of it. So we really, statistical is a great first step, but even that has some inputs into it, and then better improving that with collaboration makes it even more efficiently and effective. Demand plan is only as good as the unconstrained forecast upon which it's based. So to really come up with the best forecast, we're creating an unconstrained best view of what's going to happen in the future. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish with our forecast. So with that, we're done a little bit early for the first section. I'll be able to give a little more time to the second section then as well. So as I said, I'm going to hold the questions to the end, but I am still going to give everybody a break. So with that, I'm going to give everybody about a 15-minute break. Yep, I'll give everybody a 15-minute break. So if you return in 15 minutes, we will kick off the second topic, which is going to be data management and matrix. So we can get a lot into the matrix, so I got no problem. I think we'll have a lot of time to fill in the second session with talking about matrix. So I will see everybody back 15 minutes from now, and hope you're enjoying, and we'll talk at you soon. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break there. So we're going to start into the second session here in just a second. And really, the second session, we're going to then start focusing on demand management and metrics. Really, that first section, if you think about it, everything we talked about really started with the why. And a lot of what we talked about was really that why, understanding a customer, understanding the uses, understanding the purpose, understanding the process that you are going to be utilizing as well. So in essence, a lot of what we talked about in that first section is really from a demand planner's manager assumptions, it really becomes that understanding the why aspect of it. Next, we're going to talk about the data gathering and then the metrics aspect of it. So it's really the second part of it and the last part of it are the kind of the two things that we're going to cover in this section. Starting off with your quote, without data, you are just another person with an opinion. I've heard lots of quotes about data. This is one of my favorites because it really all starts with data. And we're going to cover a lot of different aspects with data, the types of data, cross-sectional versus time series and discontinuous. So looking at those different types of data that you could have, really the considerations that you have in the data as well, precision versus the data that's available. Because if anybody's like me, your data may not be the cleanest at where you work. So you have to understand with the need is precision okay with the data that's available. Do we need to require any aggregation for applying the statistic? Do you want to look at the aggregation up or down, either from a customer or geographic or item aggregation or time aggregation as well? We're going to look at forecasting days, hours, weeks, months. So what kind of aggregation do we need there as well? The distribution of data, is it what type of distribution? Is it normally distributed? Is it what type of data that we have as well? And then you're going to end up with some bad data. So what do we do about that data? Kind of some of the pruning and cleansing that looking at for outliers. Do we have topping, looking at the mean, omitting the outliers, smoothing it, aggregating, ignoring it? What do we do with outliers? What do we do if we have missing values? Do you replace them? Do you omit them? Do you look at a mean as well with that? Do you smooth? Do you aggregate? A lot of times when you're looking at if you have missing data at an item level, if we aggregate up, then no longer we don't have the missing variables at a family level or some type of aggregation above that. So we can actually aggregate to alleviate some missing values. Realignments that are occurring. Do we have data, items that went to another item? And what are we looking at? How do we handle those? Do we bring over all the volume to the new item? Are we looking at, how do we handle those realignments? This could happen geographically or by customer as well. Leading zeros, so you have zeros before in the model because you haven't had any sales and things of that sort. Changing factors. There's things that occur. It could be increasing a new level because you've picked up new customers, or it's just taking off. It could be trend that's really taking off and giving you some bad data as well, or some seasonal factors that may not repeat themselves. So all those things are actually, even though they're components of our forecast, they can actually become outliers and change your forecast going forward. And so it becomes a pruning exercise to be able to understand it in the past, to prune it or cleanse it so you're not getting faulty signals going forward. There's operational issues as well. I mentioned stockouts. If you have stockouts and we didn't have any sales for 2 months on an item, that could impact your forecast going forward. If we had an event, the hurricane that happened here in the States, those were an event that could impact the forecast in a certain region during a certain time period. And you would hope that's not repeatable, or it's not going to happen every year at the same time. So you understand those events or any type of operational issues that can occur that are impacting the forecast going forward. So all this is data that you have from the past, or data that different data that you're using that are really impacting future forecasts that you're going to be producing off of that forecast. One other thing real quick on types of data. I didn't actually include the slides, but I did want to touch on it very quickly here about the different types of data that you can have. And I really look at this as 4 different types of data that you have. You can have internal or external data, and you can have structured or unstructured data. So looking at those in different combinations, an internal structured data or data sources you're getting internally to do your forecasting that are structured in a way that is easily used. So most of the time, most systems, historic sales are in a system that is stored, retrievable, and in a easy format that can be used, i.e. you can take it and put it in Excel or a planning system or something of that sort. It's structured and it's internal data. So the primary internal structured data would be a great example of that would be your historic sales data that you have inside your company. And this could be shipments or sales. We prefer to use sales data, not shipments, because you're getting closer to the consumer, true consumer demand and need. And external structured data then may be your POS data. I'm selling to a customer, and that customer is then in turn selling to an end consumer. They may have POS data, point of sale data. That point of sale data is actually what that customer then is selling to the consumers. It can then be structured as well. So it's in a format that is stored. I can take it and put it in a data repository, or they're providing it for me on a certain cadence. I get this information. I can put it into a planning system, Excel. I can do a forecast or utilize it in a forecasting process. And it gets me even closer to the true consumer demand. And that's external structured data. Other external structured data could be inventory data. It could be Nielsen data. If you're looking at a collection of companies who go out and collect data for you and bring that in, and you can purchase those data. A lot of times you have to buy external data as well. Good trading partners who understand the purpose and use and improvement you can have from the forecasting process with good data, and they may work as a partnership, provide it, but there's a lot of sources you have to purchase the external data from as well. Other external data sources can be other drivers. We mentioned some of the macroeconomics as far as demographics and geographic of the consumer to better understand where they are, their median income, their different types of data we can collect on that consumer. That can all be very structured type of data as well. And it's external. You don't have it in-house, you bring it from the outside and you bring it in. Those are other external data, structured data sources as well. The last two are unstructured data. Think of unstructured data as anything you're not putting into Excel or your current planning system. Some type of manipulation has to either happen in the data to make it usable as as a numeric or some type of function that can be tied into a forecasting process or some type of algorithm. But this is a lot of unstructured data. Internal unstructured data maybe sales promotions that you're running, things of that sort that you really don't have a exact number or what's tied to it. You just know you're going to be running something during this period. There's other types of unstructured data you can pull internally as well as, from your internal website that might have comments or something of that sort that you can pull is unstructured type data. External unstructured data, there's a wealth of information, the Internet of Things out there that could have different types of information that's tied to. Just think of Alexa and Siri and all the things that's collecting information. Whether it be video, whether it be audio, those are all unstructured type of data sources as well. So this, when you really talk about types of data, we mentioned the cross-sectional time series, but you're really looking at the four major types of data: structured, unstructured, internal, and external. And with all that, you can think about the data we're utilizing. The vast majority, 90% plus, is going to be external, and then majority of that is unstructured. So we virtually haven't even touched on most of the data that's available that can be used into our forecasting process. Most of what we're going to talk about, everything we're going to talk about, is really the internal structured type of data that we're talking about, and even they're talking about time series. So with this first class, we really start touching on what we have available, and that's usually the best place to start, is the data you have available inside your organization, and making sure that it's clean, you're managing it, you're pruning it, you're cleansing it, and you're taking those same considerations with the internal data for what your purpose is going to be need and what data you have available. So a little bit side note there with when it comes about data. So when you look at data collection, there's three key points to kind of consider. One is record data in terms needed for the forecast. So you need to record the data, preferably customer request and not sales or shipments is ideal. We talked about this, do you want to do shipments or sales? That's a debate. Now, it really shouldn't be a debate because you want to get as close to the consumer demand as possible. So if shipments is all you have, obviously forecast shipments, but you want to go to sales. Even better than that is customer request. Even better than that would be like point of sale, or even better than that would be consumer sentiment. You want to get as close to that as possible. Use the same forecasting period as the planning process. I've seen a lot of companies get into problems when they start forecasting in monthly buckets, and then their planning or production is done on a daily or weekly, and it becomes that disconnect. So you have to understand, back to the purpose and use, you need to forecast in the same as whoever is using it, their planning process is in. It can go the other direction too. I can forecast daily, which is fine, but if finance is really looking for an aggregated monthly, I can get a better forecast accuracy forecasting at the monthly, and it's in the same format they're using in their planning process as well. The items forecasted should match those controlled by the manufacturer as well as reported to by finance. You're not going to forecast your own items, basically. We're going to forecast the same items that are used by the company, used by manufacturing, so everybody's tied to the same pins, same SKUs, everybody's connected. Number two, record the circumstances related to the data. If you're making changes, if you're pruning, if you're cleansing the data, any historic data, make sure you make sure why, and you record those things. Historic demand data can be influenced by events. We understand that, the promotions, weather, those things happen. But those factors need to be accounted for in the data analysis and recorded appropriately. So when you go back and you say, hey, we sold 200 this period, and we're using 100 in the prune data, why? And I'll guarantee it may be obvious the next period, but a year or so down the road, you may forget why we made that correction or prune that data going backwards. And it also helps going forward in that when those types of events reoccur, you have that point of reference to go back to and say, hey, this is what occurred last time this happened. This is what occurred the next time it happened. Okay, I'm forecasting the same event to occur next time. I have a good understanding of what may happen now. and then record the demand separately for different customer groups or different segments. Doesn't necessarily have to be customer groups, but that's generally what you're looking at it in a segmentation by customers, because they may have different seasonality, they may have different order cycles, they may be batching their forecast, their needs before they send you the demand. They have different lot size requirements, things of that sort. So understand, if you're forecasting to the customer, that those things are impacting how they're pulling from you. So that's the reason why you really need to look at it at that level of granularity when you're forecasting as well. A couple things to understand is it's be great if all history was stable. If I looked at my historic data and everything was stable, it would be fantastic. I'm not sure about you, but I'll guarantee that's not the world I live in. We have a couple different types of demand. We have stable and dynamic. Stable demand is going to fit within some type of normal variation. And items have a normal variation. Outside of that normal variation is really what we're also talking about then is dynamic demand. It tends to be more erratic. What sometimes we call outliers as well. It may have a random pattern over long horizons and becomes a lot more difficult to forecast the more dynamic your demand is. Understanding this, when you're looking at going back to pruning, when you have some of this dynamic forecast, you have to understand, why is it dynamic? Is it inherent in the item or customer that you will have some intermittent demand, dynamic demand patterns, something erratic in the demand that is inherent to the demand of that item or customer? Or was there an event that occurred, either self-imposed with promotion pricing or external as well? It could have been, this is a great example where you see this high spike outside of my normal and then low trough afterwards. I've seen this countless times with pricing and promotion, that we offer the promotion or pricing to the customer. It generates a spike in demand, which is then a trough afterwards of demand going down because people bought early. There was a large soup manufacturer that people may know of in the States that ran a promotion of 10 for 10 cans of soup for $10. And it was a great promotion, and their sales skyrocketed during the time of that promotion. The problem was being this had longer shelf life type of item, people were buying ahead and stockpiling cans of soup because it was on sale. So for periods afterwards, they've seen a major decline in their sales. It's common, and you really need to understand those things when you're looking at price elasticity, price models, promotional models, and understand where, if the dynamic portion falling outside is really driven by self-inflicted wounds, and you're really getting the full benefit of some of those promotions. And that's some of the things you're going to be able to do later on when you start understanding this data, understanding the models, understanding the errors that are occurring, and putting those pieces back together. So the first question of this section: using raw data as is in forecasting will provide the most reliable forecast. So I'll give you a minute here to answer this question on your own. Using raw data as is in forecasting will provide the most reliable forecast. And we can actually think of this a different way too. Another way you could look at this is, if I use all my data, any data source I have, is it going to make a more reliable forecast as well? So a couple ways to look at this. One way, I hope people would say false. It does not make a more reliable forecast. That you most likely need to do some type of pruning. Everything we talked about up to this point was really pruning your data and why. But you can also look at the amount of data you use as well into this question. So you can say using, if I have 10 years worth of history, is it best to use all 10 years of history, or should I use the last 3 years because they're more relevant? And the really, between true and false, the answer would be depends. It really depends on your data, depends on your market, how much changes have occurred over the last 3 years, what type of models you're going to use, how much data you use. So there's really more information needed before you could answer that one true or false. And I wanted to mention that because I don't have a question. We don't really have a slide specifically to that. But that's a question that I generally get is how much data to use. And the question is really depends. You need enough to be relevant, enough to be able to provide the forecast, the right information to do its functions, and then have enough information to be able to test the forecast reliability against in some type of holdout period. We'll get to that in a little bit. But it really depends on the amount of data. It really depends on what exactly and how you're forecasting and the model and everything. So looking at the data analysis checklist, how much data do you have? That's the first thing we're talking about. How much do you have, and do you need it all? How reliable is that data? Is all 10 years reliable, or is the only last 3 years reliable? And even the last 3 years, do you have reliable data at all? Are there data definition changes? Has data changed over time? Are the data aggregated or disaggregated? What level of aggregation are you is the data coming over to you at? And do you need it at lower levels of aggregation, or do you need to aggregate it up? Do the time periods synchronize and line up? Great example here would be we forecast in periods at Escalade. It's not lining up to a true month. We got 13 periods in a year. So we don't always line up to the weekly or daily forecast that we be able to get out. Looking at the Federation, Retail Federation calendar, it's a different time periods and different calendar. So if we're bringing in POS data or information from our retailer, it's not lining up or synchronizing to the same time periods we have. So there's a lot of data analysis that has to be done and manipulation to be able to make sure that the data I'm getting from sales and daily, the information I'm getting from the Retail Federation, from our customer, and the information we have to forecast in periods all align and synchronize. Are we missing any values? Is there any missing values, leading zeros, things of that sort? Are there outliers? We talked about outliers. If so, why? And I'll tell you right now, outliers aren't always bad. And I've seen many a company where outliers are actually the reality, where they looked at outliers as one-off, they prune those out, and they forecast, and guess what? It reoccurs. And if you look at it over far enough time, you'd actually see it as these outliers occur. Now, the outliers are intermittent. They may not occur in the same period or same time every year, but the outliers are generally occur within some type of probability over a certain time period. That said, how do you forecast that, or do you forecast? Is that become more of a supply aspect where do we cover those outliers now with demand, with a supply inventory, be more agile? How do we protect ourselves, or should we protect ourselves from those outliers? But just pruning them out and saying they don't exist may not be the best bet. I've also seen sometimes where there's a recurring factor that creates outliers. And understanding what that is, then you can then predict it as a leading indicator going forward, whether it be interest rates, whether it be different types of things that could be happening outside of your business that are impacting your business. that are actually looking like outliers, but if you isolate what the driver is, then you can have that. Perfect example of that could be your hurricane. Hurricane is an outlier, but maybe there's things you can learn from that when the next outlier and you have an agile supply chain, you can react and be able to forecast and have a response to that in time. So outliers need to be understood. You need to understand more so the why and understand pruning. Pruning is always my last thing I would do to a historic data. I generally try to keep my historic data as close to the actuals as possible. If there's truly one-off events, be careful of that word from sales or marketing, because one-off I found are usually one-offs. But if it's truly a one-off occurrence or something, yes, I will make sure I can prune it out of my history. But I need to understand those whys and then understand how much to prune, because the other part too is I've seen people generally will prune to more of an average, a mean, smoothing factors, things of that sort, and it prunes too much out, and really you need to better understand how much. And there is right and wrong answer to this, but some of it is just understanding your business, understanding the data, and some, to be able to get to that, opposed to, me being able to give you a mathematical formula to be able to truly do that. And then the last one is, are there structured shifts in the data? As mentioned, as far as the level changes, have we taken on a new customer and there's a whole new level change that occurred, or is there, trending that needs to be, dampened or need to be added into a forecast that you're not picking up? A lot of times, if you're looking at true time series type modeling, level is generally the most difficult thing to predict going forward. It takes a few different cycles really to get the level change, because the first one it looks at as an outlier, it dampens it, and going on forward, unless you're really looking at a naive or some types of moving averages, and we're going to get into those in section 4. But most exponential smoothing models generally don't do well with big level shifts. So understand what those structural shifts may be in your data. Looking at what pattern does the data exhibit? Is there randomness? Is there volatility? Is there natural, is it unstable type of demand that you have? Dynamic demand. What's the trend? Is it linear? Is it nonlinear type of trend? The seasonality. What are your seasonality? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? I have a lot of customers, and when you're looking at this, you'll probably see quarterly, monthly, and weekly seasonality, different patterns. A lot of companies quarterly, they have these rushes at the end of each quarter to make sales, and those little sales that come through. But unfortunately, sometimes it's pull forwards and things of that sort. So you end up with this quarterly seasonality. Monthly, you're going to have different buying behaviors within at the customers as well, which generates monthly behavior because different seasons, Easters and summer selling seasons and things of that sort that create seasonality. And then in weekly, even within side months, you'll have seasonality that occur because of consumer buying behaviors that may occur because they get checks at the beginning of the month and spend it and nothing at the end of the month. Or, just the converse of that, where you generally pent up demand and customers that are buying from you buy at the end of each period. So you can really see quarterly, monthly, and weekly seasonality all within the same data set. And the other types of seasonality is really more secular, where it occurs on a more of a cycle. And you have short cycles and long cycles, but these could be, every 18 months. These cycles occur because of new product launches and because of what's happening in the marketplace. Or it could be over, once every, year, you have these different cycles that occur on an annualized basis type thing. So these are more secular type of patterns that you can see in the data. Are there events and company programs affecting the data? So there's different things that the company's doing that's affecting the data, promotions, pricing, things of that sort. What phase of the product life cycle? Product life cycle is very key in understanding your data patterns. You can have a new product with early adopters taking off real quick before it becomes more stable demand. And you see this as trend. At what point do you no longer take this trend forward and understand this is stable demand? At the same time, you have the end of life cycle for items that looking at a decreasing trend. At what point does this decreasing trend continue, speed up, things of that sort? So understanding the product life cycle, if it's early or mature or towards its end of life, is important to understand the data set for those items as well. Are the data normally distributed or distributed otherwise? We talked a little bit about normal distribution. Is it, looking at different types of distributions, how is that impacting your data as well? Not everything is normally distributed. So a couple different types of data we talked about was time series and cross-sectional. We've alluded to this a few times, but in time series, you're really looking at the following things. Level. And so this would be, I'm selling 100 every period. And then next period, I sell 110 and sell 110 every period after that. That's a level shift. And that's my level. Trend. Trend would be I sold 90 last period. I'm selling 100 this period. I sell 110 next period. And that would be a trend. Seasonality would be I'm in the middle of September. I sell 110 I send 10 more than my average. So it's a 110% of my average during this period. 100 and last period was right on my average. So this is a seasonality based on different types of, everything we talked about in seasonality. Secular events we talked about, and then random variation. So every time series has a level, trend, seasonality, secular, and noise. Most of the time, you're looking at the level, trend, seasonality. It's harder to pick up the secular events in a lot of the models that we're going to be talking about and utilizing. So it's level, trend, and the normal variation, random variation, the noise, the error, whatever you want to call it, but that's the four components of a time series data. When you're looking at cross-sectional data, then you're going to have the dependent variable. This is generally what you want to forecast and is related to or influenced by another variable. That was our tires in our example of the car. The independent variable, which is known or assumed variable that is used as an indicator of another variable. So price, home sales, etc. The intercept, the point where the lines intercept the variables. And then the slope. How much is the slope? And this could be either going up or going down. So that's generally everything about data and everything we need to talk about with data and understanding with that. So, and as I said, the first thing to do is not just to take all your data and start cleansing and pruning all your data. It's better to understand the why, and then as a last resort, prune and cleanse if you need to. There's a lot of different things we talked about, different techniques. We're not getting in depth with the techniques. I recommend on your own to go back through and look at some of the pruning techniques that you have, as far as being able to average or how you can different types of pruning you can do for outliers and things of that sort and different techniques. There's a lot of information out there on it, and a lot of information at the IBF website as well on those things and past journals that discussed them. So the next part we're going to talk about then is the forecast error, or what we're looking at is how good we did at forecasting. So we did the first part was data. The last part is our evaluating the forecast. And really, there's every step in our forecasting process really needs to have two primary or fundamental objectives. First, we want to create the most accurate demand forecast we can. This is the best prediction of what is actually going to happen with the lowest amount of error. So the last part is key. We want to create the most accurate demand forecast with the lowest amount of error. That's our first. Second thing we want to do, we want to alleviate any bias, as much bias as possible. Remember, a forecasting process is generally going to interject some bias. There's lots of different types of bias that can be interjected through a forecasting process. So our two goals are to minimal error, most accurate forecast with minimal error, and to alleviate the bias. So we want to be long, above, and below as many times as we are below. So when it comes to the most accurate demand forecast with the lowest error, this says demand changed or has a trend developed. Do we need to plan around an error, exceptional one-time issue? How can we improve the forecast? Those are kind of things we take away from a error, and those are kind of the questions we ask. From the bias, does the bias exist when the cumulative variation of the actual demand from the cumulative forecast is not zero? So when we have bias is when it's either plus or minus, it's bias. Random variation is such the cumulative variation from the forecast is zero. So we're going to have a slide that really looks at that. But over time, if we're at zero from a cumulative variation, that is when we don't have bias. Every month is going to have some bias because we know we're not 100% accurate. But over time, if our cumulative variation is zero, that's our bias. We want to eliminate that bias if possible. And some of the causes of bias, and the questions we're going to ask on that is simply, are we interjecting that bias? Is there parts of our process and things that we're doing? Is there an input that's interjecting that bias? Is there a forecasting technique that's interjecting that bias? So there's different things we look at of why we're having that bias. When it comes to the actual error measurements, we got a few to be able to use. There's an error, an absolute error, a mean error, which is looking at the mean over time, the mean absolute deviation, the mean percentage error, so our looking at our actuals to forecast, our mean percent error to that, our mean absolute percent, which is an absolute value of that, and then a weighted mean absolute percent error. Most of those, and there's a few other ones as well, and the forecast value add is not listed here that I would add, and I've seen a few other errors that's utilized as well. But those are the main ones that are being utilized to evaluate the forecast and the models. I said, remember, it's not a stick. We're not beating ourselves up because we got bad error. It's really used to help evaluate the forecast and models. There's other common measurements that you may hear that are more used in evaluating the models itself. Squared error, a mean squared error, a loop mean squared error. And a lot of those are squaring the errors to kind of penalize the models for errors that are occurred. So that's the reason why we're squaring those and gives used as better for a model's evaluation. You may be familiar with the loop mean square errors utilized a lot in the regression type modeling as well. So it's used exactly to evaluate your variables and your model as a whole. But those are the main ones that you're going to see in most systems that you use yourself, that you'll come in contact with. This is the most primary error measurements that you'll come in contact with. And most systems, I said, have this as well. It's not surprising that error actually increases with product detail and time horizons. We talked about this as one of our fundamental truths at the very beginning of this. We talked about the 4 fundamental truths of as you aggregate, you actually are as you disaggregate, you're going to increase your error, or you aggregate, you generally decrease your error. Same time with your time. As you forecast further out, you increase your error versus forecasting close in, the way it should work. So what it looks at in this, if you look at your total company, a 15% error versus a 22% error at the 1 quarter, or 22% at 1 year. At a category level, so we're going down a level here from company, your forecast goes up to 20% on a lag 1. And lag 1 meaning the forecast that I'm forecasting for this month was created last period. So a 1 quarter ahead would be a lag 3, which was the forecast I created 3 months ago for this period. So the lag 3 forecast was at 20% versus the lag 1 at 15%. At a skew level, so we're really getting granular here, forecasting 1 year ahead is 31% versus at the forecast 1 year ahead. Did I just mess this up? 1 month ahead, quarter ahead, 1 year ahead. Category level goes to 20 month, 1 month. Okay, so I was looking at this a little bit wrong. So I apologize. This was one of those that was marked slides, but it's a great slide. It actually came from the IBF survey we did in 2010 on errors. And there's been a survey since then, so some of this has been updated, but you haven't really seen a lot of difference in these error measurements. I've seen it presented a little bit different way, but this is a great way of presenting it, so I apologize for getting off on the wrong foot. So kind of resetting this slide, and it's one of the disadvantages of having me instead of Mark, but resetting the slide, because it is a great slide, and understanding exactly what the forecast error is. The first batch is a total company, 1 month, lag 1, lag 3, and then 1 year out. So it's 15% at the total company, 22% at a lag 3. Jumping to the category, which is the little bit more granular, 20% at the lag 1 compared to 15% at the lag 1 at total company. And if you want to jump to skew, it's 31% at the lag 1 versus 20% at a category lag 1 and 15% at a lag 1 for the company. So this is generally broken out by each one, lag 1, lag 3, and then what level of aggregation is happening. So what you can see, no matter how you looked at it, we have a growing error as you go. And I said it's a great survey, and IBF has a lot of these surveys. I highly recommend, if you're not a member, becoming a member, because you have access to this information and more. The one thing I'd caution you then against, though, is if anybody's looking at this slide right now, and you look at this slide and go, okay, at the skew level, I'm at 55%, and this says I should only be at 31%. It's not saying you should be at 31%. It's saying that our average was 31%, and I would not use averages as a benchmark to where you should be. For multiple reasons, I don't like benchmarking against other companies and other averages, because you have different software, you have different number of SKUs, you have different time horizons, you have different aggregations that may be nuanced to what they called a skew as well. So number of planners you have, so there's a lot of different variables that it's next to impossible to do a benchmark off of a slide like this with averages. So I caution you, if you go out and look at any other slides or look at this one and say, hey, we should be doing this, don't. This is just showing you an averages and reinforcing the point that error is going to increase with either product detail or time horizon as well. The other thing that you're going to see a higher forecast is with new product. If you're looking at a average food, beverage skew for 2 months ahead for a new product, about 21%, I'd be happy if I got that. Once again, don't look at these as averages. Look at them only as averages, not against what you do. A new skew is going to be at 42%. So you're going to see a lot more variability with new skews for obvious reasons. You usually don't have history to it. There's the unknowns, what the competitors are going to do, what the price is going to do, how the market, how the consumer is going to react to it. So there's so many unknown variables you have with new items that it becomes very difficult to forecast. My topic I got coming up in a couple of weeks, I believe, or next week or a couple of weeks, I forget when I'm going to be back at you. But if you're following these online seminars, I actually have one talking about new items. And I go through about 4 hours of it talking about new items. How do we forecast new items? How do we predict sales for them? All the different models. So we're going to talk a lot bit about models here in the afternoon or in the last section of this seminar talking about different models. I'm going to take a look at those models with additional models that you can actually use and adapt new product. So I highly recommend if you have a lot of new items, we got about 40% of our items are new every year. So I got a lot of new items here. So I definitely have to understand that new product forecasting. But it goes in depth about that because there's a lot more variability to it. And when you're looking at that, new product can mean a lot of different things depending on where what you're doing. And it's not just a new item. That was, if you look at the chart on the side, what we call a new item. But it can also be a line extension. A line extension, I already sell these items in this product line. I'm going to sell this item as well. That has higher forecast, and it also has a cannibalization aspect to it as well. We have to understand. Then you can have market extensions. What's new to the market, and then what's new category you may not have played in before, and then ultimately new to the world. You can get as high as about 65% as the average error rate. It shows 60% here, but most recently I've seen it about 65% as your average error rate for something that's new to the world, something that's innovative, being able to forecast that out just 1 to 2 months ahead. So there's a lot of variation in new products as well. This brings us to the next question. For new products with long product lives are generally expected to have more forecast error than products with short product lives. So if I'm going to forecast an apparel, a clothing, shoe, let's say shoes that have a short product life cycle versus something that's a durable good that has a long product life cycle, a new product for the longer product lives are generally expected to have more forecast error than products with short product lives. So think about this one for a second, because I've actually seen people get caught up in the wording of this. So understand, and this is a great example of some of the questions you may actually get on the certification test. So, you know, when you see these type of questions, just kind of think through it. Your answer is going to be false. You would expect that long product life cycles are going to be a little more stable than a short product life cycle. Even though we're talking about new products, it's still looking at the long product lives versus the short product lives is really the key aspect of this. But both are going to have a hard time forecasting when they are truly new, depending on how new they are. So what are some of your sources of error? We talked about new products. New product obviously is a definitely source of error, but its accuracy level of data used. Bad data is a big source of error. A non-optimal method chosen. So if you choose a poor forecasting model, that is a source of error. Improperly specified model. You didn't, even though you may have a good model, you didn't have the right variables in it. You didn't run the model correctly. That can be a source of error. Structured shifts in the data. So you have, I said, level is one really difficult for a lot of exponential smoothing models to pick up. So structural shifts in data. I've mentioned that a few times now. Level change because I got bitten by it a few times. Changes in unspecified conditions. Economic, downturn in the economy. Change in the industry, unusual temporary conditions, back to our hurricane, the judgment and bias. If you have inputs, purely judgmental inputs that you have as overrides into it, Obviously, that's going to be a source of error. Changes in causal relationships. So something that may have been correlated or has a relationship of one to the other in the past, the number of website clicks equals this. Or let's another example. We have birth rates will actually impact us as sales in the future. We had the recession boom of children, less children were actually being, it was a negative boom, but less children were being born during the last recession. There's less kids getting into sports over the past few years. So it's impacted soccer, football, baseball. It's impacted a lot of these sports because there's less kids to participate. So, but that variable is going to change because we now see those variables going into and actually starting to change because there's other variables impacting now as well. But that was a causal relationship that we can model and look at. New predictive variables. Once again, for regression, if we have new variables that come into that we can utilize that are a bigger driver into predicting demand than what we had prior as well. Obviously, there's a cost of the error. That's the reason why we don't want it. And it really impacts cost, cash, and service across the board. The biggest one we're looking at is your inventory. Those are the ones that really come out as easiest to understand is your inventory. If you poor forecast, if you continually over forecast, you're going to end up with inventory, which causes product cost, storage cost, handling cost, interest, the borrowing against that capital that's locked up. It's usually excess and obsolete inventory. You end up having to do greater markdowns as well and discounts. Operating inefficiencies because you may not be able to run efficiently in manufacturing. Revenue loss is profit loss. It all equals that bottom impacts the bottom line. And then reduction in customer satisfaction and repeat purchases. If you flood the market with markdowns, it may take away from full value items that's out there as well. So that's just the impact of over forecast, but you can also have the same impact on similar impacts on under forecasting as well. Customer satisfaction, you have expediting cost, you have to air freight items in, you have customer penalties that occur as well. You have inefficiencies created because of having to run extra overtime, either from a logistics or manufacturing aspect as well. So from under forecasting can cause as much error and cost little dollars as well. So with this, which error metric do you think is the most used in business? This is the only one I have that's not a true false. And this is the only one that you may not know intuitively as well, unless you've been working and planning for a while. So you may think of, just which one you use the most, or which one do you think is the most widely used right now in businesses? So what do you think the answer would be? Actual answer would be MAPE. It's a mean absolute percentage error, what we call MAPE. So next question is changing from category level to skew level. So going from a category down to a skew in the forecasting will actually increase its accuracy. What do you think? I hope unanimously everybody said false. The one person true, you either got caught up in the language, or please email me. We're going to go back to this presentation from the start. So obviously, as you get lower in the aggregation level, you're going to increase your error, which decreases your accuracy. So we hit on a couple different, the forecasts error, the mean square error, mean percentage error, your mean absolute deviation, mean absolute percentage error, and weighted mean absolute percentage error. And this is the different calculations. And you're going to have this available to you afterwards. So please, after the presentation, you'll be able to fill out a survey. You're going to get a copy of all the slides. You actually may get it ahead of time. I'm not sure what we're doing now. But anyway, we're going to make sure you get a copy of this slide. And this is also available and a lot of the literature from the IBF as well. But these are how the formulas are laid out for the different types of forecast errors. And the key ones, you're looking at a mean percentage error, starting with it on the top right. It's your actuals minus your forecast divided by your actual. You're not dividing by forecast. You divide by your actual. Actual minus forecast divided by actual. In statistics, if you wanted to see, your variation or something, you would maybe divide by your prediction. But for this, we're measuring off of to what occurred, and you're looking at your actuals minus forecast divided by actuals. So that's your mean percentage error. Absolute value of that is going to be your mean absolute percentage error. A weighted mean absolute percentage error is going to be that absolute percentage error with a weight based on actual dollars. Is going to be a weighting factor to that to understand that all errors aren't created equal. And that gives us the weighted mean absolute percentage error. Those are the main forecast errors that we use. To kind of see those in play, we have an example here. A is my actuals, F was my forecast, my prediction for that same period. And then what you can see is your mean percentage error is your actuals minus your forecast divided by actual. Sum of those is going to be -1%. A lot of people use mean percentage error as a great proxy for bias because you can be over or under. 0 would assume that you don't have bias. Mean absolute percentage error, the same numbers, looking at these as absolutes. So instead of -2.8, it's 2.8%. Instead of -10.2, it's 10.2%. That, the average becomes 5.5%. Weighted based on my actuals, so it's the mean absolute deviation in percent of total actuals, you come up with a weighted mean absolute percentage error of 5.8. So with that, you didn't realize there was going to be homework or class work to be done. I'm going to give you, there's a couple of different class problems I have. First one is what's the mean percentage error and the mean absolute percentage error. And I'll tell you what, it's going to be the same either way, for the month of June. So if my forecast was 200, my actual demand for May was 220. Actually, my actual demand for June, that's a misquote. So my actual forecast for June was 220. What was my mean absolute error or mean percentage error for the month of June? So with that, I'm going to take my actuals minus my forecast divided by my actuals. For my weighted MAPE, though, I have June, July, and August. So if I weight it by my actuals, what would be my weighted MAPE? I'm going to give you just a minute or so. I'm not going to give you, we're starting to run a little bit short on time, and I want to give everybody a big break here coming up in about 11 or 12 minutes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but this is a great exercise you can work on your own and see how this comes out. The first one, 9%. The next one, you can work through the math and see exactly each one as a percentage of sales, what contribution to the year it has, summing those up. My weighted MAPE, weighted mean absolute percentage error, is about 17%. Looking at bias versus random variation, we talked about that. Is your bias is looking at your variation by month is greater than 0. Your random variation, my cumulative total for those periods is 0. Then there's no bias. So basically, bias is a cumulative above or below 0 on your variation. So we talked a little bit about different types of errors. So real quick, going through the different types of error you can look at. First one we're looking at would be a low bias and high accuracy. A low bias and highest accuracy is the forecast errors are small and unbiased. At the same time, the center can be different for different items. So how big the center is and how much you're targeting. The next thing we look at is something that's low bias and low accuracy. So on average, the arrows hit the bullseye, but you can see large separations between them, so it's not tightly grouped. So it may look higher levels of aggregation in this case. Yeah, still actually consistent over time, but you need to improve your sites. So you need to add in market intelligence, consumer information, maybe to get a little bit better. The next one you're looking at is a high bias, but low accuracy. Very accurate, it's just I'm biased outside of the target that we want to have, either up or down. For this, you really need to look at better bias is worse than poor accuracy in a lot of times. So consistent high bias is going to lead to service issues or inventory issues. Considering high or low is going to service or inventory issues. You need to adjust the sites here as well. It's market intel, consumer information, or not using some customer information you're getting. The last is when you're really looking at your first shots could be all over the place. You're adding in other inputs, you're adding in other information. And from this, the second shot becomes that low bias, higher accurate forecast. The difference between these two is what we call forecast value add. That's the difference between the first shot and the second shot. The forecasting process allows you to make adjustments as needed to the forecast. Forecast value add measurement allows you to know what may be wrong and what needs adjustments. And forecaster allows someone with the expertise to make the adjustment to the system, as in marketing input, sales input, to be able to hit the bullseye more consistently. So the key with that is a new metric called forecast value add. Obviously, what gets measured gets managed. Measuring mean absolute percentage error begets managing forecast variability. While the forecasting and measuring accuracy helps create efficiencies in the supply chain, it does little to reflect why someone is achieving a forecast accuracy. So the MAPE communicates the magnitude of error, mean percentage error, or other type of tracking signals, anything for bias, is communicating the direction of error. Where forecast value add actually is managing the forecasting process. It's adding visibility into the input and provides a better understanding of the sources that contributed to the forecast, so one can manage their impact and forecast properly. Forecast value add communicates the change in performance of any input or process step from one step or input to the other. It works by adapting whatever traditional metrics you have, MAPE, mean absolute deviation, bias. You can actually adapt it to any of those, but most commonly used with MAPE. So basically what it does, I said, it's the change in performance metric that can be contributed to a particular activity, whether it be a process step, an input, a model, any particular activity in the forecasting process. So it's measuring the forecasting change in the forecasting performance. The most commonly what you use is a prior baseline MAPE. So what would be my forecast prior to this? Adding in the new process step, new input, what's my MAPE afterwards? Calculating those two MAPEs, the delta between those two is my forecast value add. It can be positive or negative. Positive says, hey, you're making improvements. Negative says, guess what? You're actually taking away from the accuracy of this process, which we see a lot. There's a lot of inputs that may not add value. using forecast value add, you can help identify what those inputs are or process steps that's not adding value. So this is a simple example looking at what my forecast was versus a naive versus the baseline forecast versus a sales override and what the actual demand was. The next is we can actually see what the MAPEs were for the naive forecast, for the baseline forecast, and for the sales overrides. What we can see is actually the sales override, we're improving the forecast, naive forecast by 3%, but the sales override is actually worse than naive and actually taking away from the baseline forecast. Be careful, 1 point does not make a trend. So we can't look at one period and say, hey, let's throw everything out. But over time, it helps you identify those inputs, those process steps that may not be working. One of the best things you do with forecast value add is compare it back to a naive forecast. Anything we're doing in our forecasting process, we can generally compare back to a naive forecast. The problem is though, what is a naive forecast? According to the Institute of Business Forecasting, a naive forecast is something simple to compute, requiring minimum of resources. So if you looked at this example right here, what would you call the naive forecast? Is it the prior period, about 1,100 units for period 4? Prior year sales, we did 875, so maybe that's the naive forecast. Budget is 900 every period, so is 900 my naive forecast I'm comparing against? My stat forecast, my baseline stat forecast was 974 before I added any kind of additional input from sales or anybody. So is that my baseline forecast? Think about it from an operations standpoint. If you didn't give supply chain a forecast or your operations or manufacturing a forecast, how much are they going to produce? How much, if you ask finance what we're going to do in period 4, what number they're going to come up with if you don't give them a forecast? Chances are the forecast that they're coming up with is something simple to compute, requiring minimum number of resources to compute it. That's a naive forecast. So your answer could be any of those that could vary. The basic naive forecast, a random walk, is your prior period. A seasonal random walk by definition is your prior year same period. So your 1100 is your seasonal is your random walk, 875 is your seasonal random walk. Those are traditional naive forecasts. And those are great starting points to be able to understand exactly if you're highly seasonal, use a seasonal. If you're not highly seasonal, more stable, use the naive. But both of those are naive forecasts is a great starting point. But even then, anything can be your naive forecast. Which brings my next question. Are you smarter than a naive forecast? And what we found out that actually Sass and Mike Gilead's book, Business Forecasting, Practical Problems and Solutions, actually helped do a study over 300,000 and found out a staggering 52% majority of the people do not do better in their forecasting process than a random walk. And remember I said random walk was just the prior period. So the system generated forecast actually was worse than a random walk. So be careful, and that's why you should always measure against a naive forecast. A few different suggested best practices of forecast value add. Map out your process and your input steps. So understand your current process, so understand what steps you want to measure against. Keep the calculations simple and transparent so everybody understands. Understand it basically, here's your MAPE, I'm going to measure the difference between the two. Be careful not to jump to conclusions. I said 1 point does not make a trend. So look at it over time to understand really where you need to focus. Make it visual. Put the calculations, the forecast value add up front and what the different steps are, so people can understand exactly where they see the puts and takes and what's adding and taking away value over time in a process. Keep consistent. Measure the same process the same way. Set targets and baselines over time, and then look for the bottlenecks. Use this as a tool to help identify those bottlenecks and where you are creating value and where you may not be creating value. So this brings us to the end of our second topic, data management and matrix summary. A couple of points here. Bad data will most likely produce a bad forecast. Data management is an important step in the demand planning process, and maintaining the right data should be a consideration. Sometimes it's 60–80% of our job is the data management aspect of it, so it should be a consideration. MAPE helps show the magnitude of error. Bias shows the direction of error. Those are two key performance indicators you need to understand, but understand one's teaching you the magnitude, the other's showing you the bias or the direction. And then forecast value add actually measures the change in the forecasting performance metric that can be attributed to a particular activity. It measures your process. So it's something you need to hopefully integrate as well. So with that, I wanted to leave at the end of topics 1 and 2, a little bit of time to really take some of those feedback, take some of the questions, be able to answer some of those questions. I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes before I want to kind of break for what I'm having as my lunch, or maybe someone's dinner, or somebody else's just 1 hour break. So in about 10–15 minutes, I'll give you an hour break. But with that, I wanted to open up right now for any type of questions. At the side, there's an opportunity to ask some questions. I see some people already have. Please jump in with some other questions, anything you want a little more talk about. I'll spend as much time all the way through lunch if necessary answering some of these questions if need be. But I want to give people a chance to break if they want. So with that, this is the end of section 1 and 2. Let's open it up for any type of questions. Thank you.